Good morning, everyone, and welcome to an HGP Sunday meeting. My name is Todd Kimball. It's an honor to be your MC this morning. That humanism is a rational philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. It advocates the extension of participatory democracy and the expansion of an open society standing for human rights and social justice. And our reader this morning always provides outstanding, thoughtful readings, Mr. Laurent Beauregard. Laurent.
It's an honor to be your reader this morning. It's going to remind you of a previous reading, but it's totally different. This is The Vatican Rag by Tom Lehrer, and I will be reciting this before the 3 minutes is finished. But first, I need to give you an introduction in case there's some information bits that you may be missing. Not all of you grew up as a Catholic as I did back in the early 50s. Anyway, in the early 1950s, 60s, as a matter of fact, the Roman Catholic Church held its second ecumenical council known as Vatican II. You may remember this. There it was decided to introduce the vernacular into portions of the Mass, and secular music was soon to follow. On noticing this, Tom Lehrer composed the song, The Vatican Rag. The lyrics use a few words that warrant explanation. I was an altar boy back then. I used to serve Mass, so I can share what I'm about to tell you. At the beginning of the Mass, there is a chant called the Kyrie, more fully, the Kyrie eleison. Also in the course of the Mass, a miracle known as transubstantiation happens, for which certain magic words are required. These words are, this is Latin, hic est enim corpus meum, which translates to, this is my body, which is what Jesus allegedly spoke at the Last Supper. When the priest says these words, a piece of bread turns into the body of Christ. The whole point being that Catholics can now ingest the body of Christ when they take communion. How cult-like is that? The word transubstantiate occurs in Tom Lehrer's Vatican Rag. The song also mentions genuflections and confessionals, but probably everyone knows what these words mean. Oh, one more thing about the Kyrie. This is for us music lovers. The Kyrie eleison constitutes the first movement in each of Mozart's masses. These Kyries are amazing. For example, in the Mass in C minor, the so-called Great Mass, is that Kyrie there is something that you really, really need to experience, no matter how secular you are. Okay, now it's time for the song. Shall I recite it or shall I sing it? Not sure. It goes like this. First you get down on your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Do whatever steps you want if you have cleared them with the pontiff. Everybody say his own Kyrie eleison, doing the Vatican Rag. Oh, I could use piano accompaniment here so badly. Get in line with that processional, step into that small confessional. There the guy who's got religion will tell you if your sin's original. If it is, try playing it safer. Drink the wine and chew the wafer. 2, 4, 6, 8. Time to transubstantiate. So get down upon your knees, fiddle with your rosaries, bow your head with great respect and genuflect, genuflect, genuflect. Make a cross on your abdomen. When in Rome, do like a Roman. Ave Maria, geez, good to see you. Getting ecstatic and sort of dramatic and doing the Vatican Rag. That's it.
Thank you, Laurent. Outstanding job on a very difficult song to sing. Our presenter this morning, Lisa Kendall, is the founder and director of Counter Cult Coalition, an Oregon-based nonprofit working to protect and provide for people who have grown up in cults. She has been active in the cult awareness community since 2012 by providing support for former members in civil suits, testifying before legislatures, writing and speaking about the impact of coercive group involvement. Lisa has a master's in public administration with a focus on public-private partnerships and extensive experience in business and nonprofit management. Her main projects are supporting advancements in the countercult community and working for better public policy to allow children in cults more meaningful lives. Lisa joins us live from Portland, Oregon. Let's have a warm welcome from the Friendly House and a warm yet muted welcome from our Zoom community for Lisa Kendall.
Thank you for having me. So I founded Counter Coalition. I have to warn you, I'm not good at public speaking, and I'm actually not really good at anything I do for Counter Coalition, which is true, but somebody's got to do it. So I do building the board, fundraising, meeting with legislators or policy people. I do our technology, which is funny. Luckily, David DiNucci has been very helpful with that. And I appreciate that every little bit of leverage really makes a difference in our arena. So it's a very small operation. Our mission is to improve public policy to better protect and provide for children harmed by cults. I changed it to harmed by, because you can be harmed by a cult without ever being one. A thing that we're talking about more these days is if your parents were in a cult and you're a child and they're dealing with all of this stress of leaving and all of the residual effects and haven't had therapy. So that's a newer category that we talk about now. So one of the things I'm working on right now is a bill to, the first bill would be to get $250,000 from the Oregon legislature to form a committee, and the committee would look at the issue, what needs to be done, and what our suggestions are. In talking to policymakers and meeting with Representative Lisa Reynolds, it looks like we would get money from the Foster Care Transition Program, which is a federal program that is also has a local money going into it. I think Oregon might have a more robust system for helping people transition out of foster care. So there's a good pot of money there to tap into that would allow someone raised in a cult, as long as they came to us before the age of 24 and they were in when they were under 18, they would get expanded medical, dental, optical. And for this project, what we have so far laid out would be cult-informed suicide prevention, because the suicide rate is really high for people from cults, especially from specific ones. And some of that is actually tracked, you know, who died when, how many per year, things like that. So yeah, we had a bit of a slowdown because the GOP in Oregon walking out this last session, which so many bills didn't get passed. So, you know, and real people are needing the benefits. That's why we pay them to be our representatives. Right? So obviously I'm not very happy about that. Okay, so every time I come here, you guys always give me a hard time about what is a cult. So I don't want to answer a bunch of questions this time about it. So in the counter cult world, we don't debate it. So you can decide for yourself what is a cult, and you can look online. The number one criteria we use is Steve Hassan's BITE model. You can see him on like CNN when the Taliban or white supremacist or other cults come to the fray. They often hire him to go online, and I've met him a couple of times. He's got very good research. So if they're controlling your behavior, information, thought, and emotions, that is the main criteria for a cult. It doesn't have to be all of those. And, you know, what I say, because I remember last time somebody said that it was really sad that we're talking about it in degrees. But if you think about the times where you make an appointment with your doctor 2 months in advance, or when you call and say, I need to get in this week, or when you say to a friend, drive me to the ER, or when you call an ambulance, they're all a problem that needs addressing. Anyway, they all need addressing. They just need different levels of care and different kinds of expertise. So there are many harmful organizations, not just religions. There's here in Portland, Loving Hut. I'll say that on the record. They can try to sue me. Loving Hut is widely considered a cult. They do yoga and vegan meals. And one of the reasons they're considered a cult is they, if you end up working in their restaurants for free, so you're exploited, and the leader, even though it's supposedly a nonprofit, as far as I understand, is not transparent with the money. And while you're working there, you're only allowed to see her videos and her information. So it's controlling behavior and information. And another criteria we look at is, are you exploiting someone for the benefit of yourself or the group? So Loving Hut, it's all over the US. There's a restaurant here in Portland too. Widely considered a cult. Anyway, there's all different kinds of cults. There's yoga cults and political cults. And so people will go, it's about coercion. I could coerce you into voting. I could trick you and push you and manipulate you into voting. That doesn't make it a cult. So it's a certain kind of coercion and to a certain extent. So this is International Cult Awareness Month, which is why I'm here. Happy International Cult Awareness Month. So my friend Tabitha Chapman started ICAM, like many of her other projects. The Freedom Train Project, which is actually an organization. I don't know, she might not like me calling it a project. She's amazing. She's a PhD candidate, a therapist, a web guru, and she is an expert in domestic violence issues. She's a champion for former members from cults. She's first gen, I'm second gen. There's a bit of a divide in our world between first gen and second gen. People who chose to or were manipulated into joining a cult as an adult are called first gen. And then people who grew up in the cult from their caregivers who brought them in my case, my mother, are second gens. And she is a first gen who's lovely to work with. She spent some painful time in Nexium. She lives in California with her partner and twin boys. I said that because there was no room to say where she lives. I want to tell you where all of my friends live. I have a lot of friends working in the counter cult space. So some of the former cult members and their projects, we just talked about Tabitha Chapman. She's working right now on a media and ethics project. We have a real problem in the counter cult world with people exploiting former members. Cults have been known to do that. Some people who've never experienced life in a cult. So it would be podcasts. There's a problem with documentaries, changing the title to something salacious, which looks like clickbait. And there are a number of other issues. We're looking at having the people who can to pay participants. If they're making money from our stories and the time we take to tell them, we're hoping in the future that they'll give, let's say, 10% of what they make toward a counter cult project of some sort. Sarah Steele is amazing. I recommend looking up her podcast. It's one of the very best in the podcast realm, period. It might even be the very best in our world. She's amazing. She's does very accurate podcast interviews. She's written a fantastic book, Do As I Say. Jennifer French is a therapist. She was in kind of like a Christian self-help cult. She lives in California. She's working on various projects right now. And Daniela Mestinick-Young, she's the author of Uncultured. I know that Marsha Abelman read her book and really enjoyed it. And she is a speaker. She speaks a lot about how organizations, companies, businesses, government organizations can be culty or even cults. So then there is Jill, my dear friend in England. She is I don't have a separate slide on her, so I'll tell you a little bit more about Jill. She grew up in the Exclusive Brethren, and that's a really weird cult. It is very strange. And so she's an activist for people from the Exclusive Brethren. It is a huge organization all over the world and very, very controlling in many, many ways. She also right now is pushing for better research in our world and best practices for the nonprofits in the countercult arena. She's also on the board to help select board members for the International Cultic Studies Association. She has a master's in, I think, counseling and a PhD in some kind of psychology. I don't remember. I'm not doing her justice. She's lovely. Oh dear, this is Misty Griffin. She always somehow gets the shaft. So we have half of her picture here. She was the author of Tears of the Silenced and a consulting producer on Sins of the Amish. I presented quite a bit here last winter on the plain communities like the Amish and Mennonites and how horrible, abusive they really are. People think they're a peaceful people. They're forgiving in ways that are very unhealthy. So you could do just about anything in the Amish and Mennonites and they'll forgive you and not call the police. She's done a lot to raise awareness about that. She has a wonderful petition out there. So if you look up #invisible, please, please, please sign her petition. She's doing amazing work. She's a registered nurse with a small child and still manages to pull together press conferences and be an activist. It just amazes me. And as I said, she's out there helping us better understand some of these organizations that people don't think of as cults. The Amish, that's a cult. So are the Mennonites. If you leave, they shun you. If you do something they don't like, they'll shun you. In the Mennonites, they can tell you to tear out your rose bushes. They're too worldly. And so people often live in fear of things like that. Oh, I hope the bishop doesn't think my rose bushes are too worldly. And that's a real world example. This is Danielle Lemestinic Young. She's in Maryland. She has a really good picture of herself in uniform. She was one of the first ever women, the first team, as I understand it, in the military to go to Afghanistan with the men. And it was very dicey back then for many reasons. Abuse of women, women told you have to stay home, you can't go out, like go salsa dancing with the men. You can't. So then what are they? Lonely, depressed, bored, and experiencing sexual violence, something she's working on. So that's her when she was a runner in the Army. She grew up Children of God. That's one of the worst cults out there. Very high suicide rate for the former children. She's very high achieving. A lot of that she credits to her life in the cult. People will tend to, I think, be ineffective and have trouble coping, or they become workaholics. And so she went to Harvard and got, really high grades, super fast runner, ran faster than the men, became a intelligence officer, a woman intelligence officer with lots of men under her, and that was a while back. She speaks on a variety of topics about how your organization can be cult-y. She's also working on a continuum for cults, which is something Steve Hassan presented at our last conference. So there was one of those things where they're both working on it at the same time. And that would be looking at when something is merely culty or cult-like, and the extreme of the Children of God, which, like on a scale of 1 to 6, the Children of God would probably be 47. So, and that's where she grew up. That's the one where they hid the children and changed their names, and Interpol and the FBI were looking for them all around the world. So they kept moving the children from one country to another with fake IDs and passports and overstaying their visas. And so she speaks several languages, like a lot of the children from the Children of God. One of the benefits of hiding you around the world so no one could rescue you is that you speak many languages. And so this is a little bit more about her. MS in organizational psychology from Harvard. She is a champion knitter. You can see lots of videos on her on TikTok and YouTube, knitting while she talks and does presentations, or the beautiful clothes she makes. And I forgot, she actually met, I can't remember which president it was. Was it Trump or Obama? Yeah, so, and she's, TikTok star, that's funny. I went to the International Cultic Studies Association's conference in Kentucky in June and July. So I just got back the middle of last month. And I stayed in an Airbnb in Louisville, and my host is a huge fan of hers. And he kept going, I can't believe you know her. Very funny. I've also had people say, oh, you got to talk to that person? It's like, yeah, they're friends. This is Debbie Shriver. She lives in Tennessee. She helped put on the marvelous conference we had this last year. Debbie became interested and knowledgeable about cults because someone approached her asked her to write a book about the Tony Alamo cult. If you want to read a weird cult in Hollywood, so it's weird Hollywood stories, that's Tony Alamo. And so she wrote the book, Author Whispering in the Daylight. And then that's the Children of the Tony Alamo Ministry. I met Debbie at a conference in DC in 2014 when she was just starting to write the book. And I took a picture of her, and I just found it on Facebook recently. It popped up as a memory. And it said something, the blonde is writing a book, because I didn't catch her name. The blonde. And it's a very, very, very well-researched book too. She's the founder of Keys to Me, which helps people who have been harmed through any kind of coercion. I'm guessing that that includes domestic violence, but also covers cults. So this is a new organization she found. She's on the Foster Care Review Board, PBS board member. She was a major volunteer. I don't know what all she did for the Girl Scouts, but she's big there too. She was a writing professor, recently retired early, lucky her, and she's lovely. She has really moved our entire movement forward. It used to be more, well, the tone was kind of harsh, a lot of us felt. It wasn't as welcoming or inclusive. Most of us would say it leaned Christian, maybe male, and more conservative, and so she has brought in more inclusivity, a softer tone, and she's very approachable. I've spent a lot of time telling her all my complaints about the organization she manages and organizes, and she's just getting better and better all the time. And she wants to hear those complaints, which is lovely, because I love to complain. This is Sarah Steele. I mentioned her earlier. That is, look at all those books. Do As I Say. She is brilliant, super, super smart. She lives in Australia. I just did her podcast, and it just came out about a week ago. And I've already had people reaching out to me. One person who heard me on her podcast last week is in a counseling program, and he asked me about an internship related to cultic studies here in Portland. So we're trying to hook him up with something. So every time I speak, good comes of it, more connections in the community. I've done podcasts and had a law student say, I want to help, which we all need people who, know anything about the law, and he's fabulous. Her podcast is called Let's Talk About Sex. She's a podcast award winner, Webby Award winner. She speaks and does all sorts of interviews. And she's setting a really high bar for us. Right now, we're working on the quality of podcasts. We're working on accuracy and ethics. And she's joining the team to help on that, which is great because she's so amazing. I got to know her because I sent her an email telling her that she had interviewed someone that we know isn't very honest from the cult I grew up in. And she was mortified. And so I listened to the podcast, and one single thing he said wasn't true, which was a major surprise to me. I know him well. I vacationed with him here in Oregon. Anyway, why should you care? Well, if we work on these issues, we can reduce crime and homelessness and the things that you experience. So it isn't just hurting people from cults. Children from cults need a lot of therapy, and they get a lot of that for free, whether someone's volunteering. People will donate money to therapists in our world so they can have free therapy. There are a lot of people leaving cults right now, we think, because of social media. So there's way too many people for the few therapists we have that specialize in cults. And a lot of that is done by Zoom, like in England, California, New York. You have therapists who meet with people on Zoom typically. I don't know. I've never had a therapist who is a cultic expert, and I have great therapists. My therapist right now is trauma informed, and she helps me understand the world. Often we just end up talking. So I'm like, why would this person do this? And she explains the neurology to me, sociology, that, prehistoric brain. I love that. I love that. Anyway, getting back to what you pay for. Many cults will use the work, especially of women, cooking, doing laundry, working in the garden, and they're not a part of the world. You can't go out into the world. You shouldn't have friends out in the world. And it's funny how they always call it the world. And then especially the women, mostly the women, when they're too old to be of service in the community, they send them to the government-funded nursing homes. So then they're suddenly just dropped off somewhere when maybe they've been decades inside the cult, working their entire lives, sold their house, gave them the money, and they're just withering away in a nursing home. And you're paying for that. So you're paying for someone to be miserable. If we can address this, prevent child abuse, improve the mental health of children in general and children from cults, it would save all of you a lot of money. I know a lot of people just from the cult I grew up in who've spent time in prison. My own sister was in and out of prison before she died of a heroin overdose. And her life was so miserable, I was actually glad she died. So not an uncommon story in our world. Again, who's paying for the prisons? I know several people from the cult I grew up in are still in prison right now. If we fostered the potential for these people, they could, instead of costing money, contribute to society. So you would have people who are better informed voters, people who are doing less damage to our environment, and people who are contributing in other ways. A lot of people from cults say that, they want to help people, so they'll become therapists. We have some really good therapists in our midst too. Some people join therapy. Most people go into the profession because they have some issues related to their childhood. So the quality isn't consistent in the general population, but we've got good therapists in our world, which is interesting to me. Be a lot less pressure on all social services. If you're not having to have people show up for suicide attempts, you're not having to pay for, these early graves. Yeah, I know this sounds really horrible, but people are living this. And we're all paying for it in one way or another. My own sister, I remember she told me, and I love my sister, but she had been harmed far more than me in the cult we grew up in. I remember her telling me that when she robbed a donut shop, she threw coffee in the woman's face, and I was just horrified by that. But this is what happens. Hurt people hurt people. So we should all care about it. And how can I help? Reading cult memoir and watching documentaries is helpful. For one thing, you're less likely to say something that isn't true to misinform the public, which we find frustrating. And you're in a better position to talk to people about it, to recognize when someone is in a cult or a culty situation. After hearing about this, you find someone who works in a coffee shop. There's one in Selwood that was just shut down. It was found to be a cult. Everyone lived inside the building next to the coffee shop. They all worked for free. It's that common. It's all over Oregon. And I think it's more prevalent in California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, places like that. And I want to just say what I say every time. The United States does not do as good of a job dealing with cults as Western European countries do. They have wonderful legislation. They outlaw groups. The freemen, the ones who say that no law applies to them, they don't have to have birth certificates. They don't have to register their children. They don't register their guns, their cars. They don't do anything. They get pulled over by the police. The police try to tell them, you have to step out of the car. And they will fight it. And they often end up dead in a shootout with the police. And they're outlawed in France, but they're legal here. So there are things we can do. Also, the US, this is the only fucking country who has signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child and not ratified it. The only country. We haven't ratified the ERA either. We've got work to do. So sharing posts about cults on social media is really important. We are the new civil rights movement. So you think about all the pressure and the pushback people had, let's say Black people in the 1960s. And, we've got Stonewall as one of the famous events most of us know about that moved the gay rights movement forward. We have some of those same watermarks in our arena. We want more of the world to know about it. So sharing it on social media just puts it on someone's brain. The reason for that is you want to be an informed voter. If you're meeting with your state representative and your state representative, is talking about funding for children from cults, you want to be able to go, thank you. So show up at City Hall. They have these online meetings you can do on. He does home shares all over the world, so he's constantly traveling. Thank you. So if you've got a spare minute and you recognize that children from cults have a hard time speaking up for themselves for many reasons, most are very uneducated. The ones with advanced degrees are very rare. When I was 17 or 18, it must have been 17, I said I wanted to go to college and I was told I couldn't because it would take me away from God. So, many cults are very anti-education. There are a lot of them who only educate to 6th or 8th grade and say that's enough. That includes many Amish and Mennonite communities. So just calling and leaving a message, I'm concerned about children in cults in Oregon. What are you doing about it? Leaving that message would make me very happy. And you can volunteer for one of the many counter cult causes. There's a woman who founded an organization to help women who grew up in cults go to college, and she walks them through the whole thing. There are people who work on interventions. There are researchers like my friend Jill. Carol Murchison is an attorney in our world. She specializes in Buddhist cults and civil cases involving sexual abuse and sexual assaults. She retired and she was asked to come out of retirement. And so she says she failed at retiring twice. Met her in Kentucky, and she said she had 15 cases at the time. She gave a great presentation on the latest in the law. At our conferences, there's a bit of science, like neurology, what's going on with these cult leaders' brains, law, what are the latest ways we've discovered we can sue cults or hold them accountable. One of the great things I learned at the conference about the neurology of the brain, scientists have been able to isolate this sausage-like place in the back of the brain, where if you either do drugs or you experience like head trauma or some kind of accident, trauma, or a scientist can stimulate it with an electric shock, and you will have this mystical experience that many people attribute to religion. Oh, and they really believe it because they did have a real experience. They're just attributing it to the wrong thing. And we've been able to pinpoint now better how some people think that they are past life regression and afterlife, and I went toward the light and I left my body. I've always known that was in the brain. A lot of the body leaving stuff is that the brain or the eyes and the ears, when you've had some kind of a head trauma, or if you're in surgery, if they don't connect up, your brain doesn't know what to do. Your ears and your eyes have to be in sync. So when they're not, your body just goes out of the body. Well, it's like, what the fuck is going on here? I'm sorry, I love to swear. Anyway, donating to any one of the many causes in our world, or like David DiNucci, he's on our advisory board. David has helped me with a variety of computer problems, some ridiculous and some a little bit more challenging, which makes me feel good when it takes him a minute to sort it out. I would ask people to learn which questions are most appropriate. I have to say, it's like we all know that you don't walk up to a Black person and say, "Can I touch your hair?" So, and I hate to say this because I understand why people ask, but my one pet peeve is when I tell someone I grew up in a cult and they say, "Where were your parents? And where did you live?" As if all parents are good, no parents would join. And so then it's hard to explain that because you have to just have people step back from their view of the world. Not all parents have their best interest at heart. All these commercials around Mother and Father's Day, your mom knew best, your mom loved you more than anyone else. That is definitely not always true. And I can tell you from the cult I grew up and many others I know, the people are not very loving. So especially if you're denying your child medical care just because you don't want them to go to a hospital and have people know what's going on in their lives, so then they're already experiencing horrific kinds of abuse, neglect, missing school. And on top of it, they can't go to the doctor because then they'd be above the radar. So when people think, when people talk cults, they'll go, "Oh, do you know the Rajneeshis? Do you know this one?" Because we know of some, that it is so much more widespread where they have these wonderful measures of staying under the radar, including the move of God. I remember growing up being told, "Don't get your kids a social security number." In fact, that's one of the things I want is increased penalties for parents who don't get social security numbers for their children, who don't register their births. We've documented children right here in Oregon dying, and nobody even knew they existed. You have to go out and go to Oregon City and Molalla and go out there and count the graves, look at the babies' graves, and then you can go back and talk to the Attorney General. Oregon's previous Attorney General would call into the followers of Christ and tell them, I don't want to have to come arrest you, but if you don't take your children to the doctor when they're not healing, I might have to do that. So we have women and men, most women, who have spent time in prison here in Oregon for letting their children die from easily treatable things. They go to prison, get out, do the same thing, another child dies, go back to prison. Rita Swan, who I met at the Free Thought Conference at PSU, were any of you here for that? Oh gosh, wasn't that amazing? Yeah, I plopped down next to Rita Swan, and I was in such a good mood. I had done the politics and religion seminar, which was like so packed full, it had to be illegal. There's no way that it was fire safe, but it was so fabulous. I'm glad they let us spill over. And I was in such a good mood. I plopped down next to her at the table, and she had just given a presentation about children dying in Oregon and babies dying. And she got into this because the Christian Science, which some people don't think is a cult, told her your baby is dying because you don't have enough faith. And if you take your baby to the doctor, we'll disown you, we'll excommunicate you. And she was 19, had grown up Christian Science. She would have had to leave her parents, her friends, her world. So, her baby died in her arms, and then she started going around the world, passing legislation, not just to require people to take their children to the doctor, but to give people an excuse so they wouldn't be excommunicated. They can say, I'm sorry, I have to, I don't want to go to prison. So there's so many ways to get a bite at the apple. And, we've been addressing it from all these different angles, including just upping the quality in the counter cult world, looking at that from different angles. We're talking about what to do about patriarchy, and what to do about podcasts, and what to do about the FGA versus SGA experience. So anyway, I much prefer people asking questions like, what's going on in the counter cult world? Is there something new? What are the laws related to that? Not that anyone's going to know that, but I had the worst mother. Seriously, my mother was so horrible that they didn't let us go to a farm in Alaska. And we had a basement full of all the stuff you need to live without electricity, because we were supposed to move out there with no electricity and water. Lots of my friends did that, and they would go to school, church, eat their meals, work in the garden, work everything on this farm with all these other people without electricity or water. The boys were bringing the water up by horseback from the creek, and the girls cooked and did all that without electricity. Eventually, they all got electricity. But luckily for me, my mother was not very popular. So one of the benefits was I didn't get to go to one of those places. And I always knew, it's like, how come we don't get to go? A lot of those people came back with serious horror stories, well documented. And it's really important to know how to engage people. If you think they might be in a cult, or you have a family member, do not ever criticize the group. It makes them step back. What all of the research shows is that if you're friendly with them, you're kind, you include them, you send Christmas cards, you keep in contact, an occasional phone call, even if it's not a close friend, that occasional phone call. If you are having some contact with the outside world, it makes it easier for you to disengage. Because I lived in Portland, Oregon, in a city most of the time I was in the cult, until I was 17, and I went to live on one of these horrible little farms in Minnesota, in northern Minnesota. It was just awful. Anyway, I was disengaging over and over throughout my life. And so I didn't have, this momentous thing that caused me to leave. A lot of people leave because they get kicked out. So, you can allow rape in your cult. You can even say people have to, children of God, you have to do that. But somebody I know smoked pot and they were out. No, you can commit terrible crimes, but you can't do that. So again, when you are talking to somebody, and like my family members never told me I was in a cult, they could have talked to me about it. And it was like years later, my aunt's like, oh, remember that cult you grew up in? And it was just like, I didn't even know it was a cult when she said that. And she did. So, you know, all you have to do is ask a question. What do they believe? And if you find common ground with their belief system and a Christian church, that can help people find their way out, because they're like, oh, maybe we're not so special after all. And asking them just basic questions, you know, why can't you go to the movies? Why can't you talk to your family? But after you have established rapport, kept it up, and definitely not in any way that could be seen as threatening. And I left lots of time for question and answers, because you guys like to ask me over and over and over, what is a cult?
Thank you, Lisa, for a thorough presentation this morning and for your work with the Counterculture Coalition. I will start with a question that I will read from our Zoom community. Al Christians asks, how many cult members hold elective offices in the US, and how many others hold office requiring legislative confirmation?
There have been a couple that I know of. One of them was that woman from Alaska, I think it was, where she ran for president. I can't think of her name. No. Sarah Palin has connections to the cult I grew up in. If she hadn't loaned us her fish well, people would have gone hungry. Interestingly enough, the woman I was just referring to, was her name Gabby, or can't think of it. She did that television show, Finding Your Roots, and she had them leave all the information out about the cult because her father had started it. And when she did it, I think she did it while she was running for office.
We've got Joyce at the mic, and Gail, I see your hand up. We'll get to you next, but let's start with a question from Joyce at the Friendly House.
Lisa, I'm guessing that you are familiar with the book Women Talking. We just read that in our book group, I think, for this group.
I would love to have joined that.
Oh, I'm sure. Yes. So how extreme do you think, is that pretty typical of cult, or was that one on the edge of the extremes?
I haven't read that one, and I haven't seen the movie yet. But wasn't that one of the plain communities, like the Mennonites or Amish?
That was Mennonites. And if anyone here does not know what it's about, a group of women in that cult discover after several years that the reason they were waking up in the morning with bruises and bleeding and that sort of thing is that they were being drugged with a drug that was used for the horses. I can't remember what the point was, but
and then being raped.
And they were being raped, yeah. And they discover that, and so the whole story, there's a film now, they've made a film, I haven't seen it, is the women talking about whether they should, number one, leave, number two, fight back, address the men that have been the problem and fight back, or continue the way they are. It's very moving.
It's absolutely against the rules in Mennonite and Amish communities to report anything to the police. If you do, you're excommunicated. And they know that. Well, I have an exhibit right now at the Hillsdale Library, and thank you, HGP, for loaning me some books for it. So I've got books in there from Richard Dawkins, and so that it's balanced out with all of the cult memoir and recovery information I have there. But there's a woman who, wow, I didn't have a slide for her, Patty Bear. She grew up Mennonite, and she wrote a book called From Plain to Plain. She became one of the first female Air captains. And she wrote the book, I was just saying, From Plain to Plain. And it is a part of my exhibit. And in her memoir, she talks about how her mother was being horrifically abused by her husband, and how they weren't allowed to go to the media or report to the police. And the husband was going out and giving interviews about how he was the victim. And so he ended up raising a lot of money and spending all their money on all this PR campaign, very expensive PR campaigns, without supporting his children. So his children all had to work in grade school to support the family because the father wouldn't. Anyway, you can see some of her story, and she did the lovely posters in my exhibit. And her book is at the Multnomah County Library. There's a lot of cult memoir there. If you go to my exhibit, you'll see a long list of books, DVDs, ebooks, audiobooks. Our library has a lot of cult memoir. And thanks to ICAM, they purchased more. So since I had the exhibit, we got more books. So much good has come of this. Each little thing we do ends up providing us something else in the community. Thank you, Joyce.
Okay, let's go to a question from Gail in our Zoom community.
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
We got you.
Okay, cool. So you mentioned a group earlier and you said it really quickly and I wanted to learn more about it. It was called Loving something or other. Loving what?
That's a restaurant in Portland called the Loving Hut. It's in California and upstates. On a scale on cults, I'd probably put it in the middle. It's not one of the worst. It's a restaurant, so people have a lot of ties to the community still. But it is widely considered to be a cult, even outside of the cult community. Don't eat there.
Okay. I've never, first time I've heard of it. The other thing, it just that was a very brief one. Just wondering if you would consider the current Republican Party and those people who are extreme loyalists to Trump. Would you consider that a kind of a political cult, or?
That I would say is at the bottom range of a cult. It is very culty for sure. People are fed misinformation. They're exploited. I mean, look at all these people paying for Trump's legal fees. That's just crazy. So there is that continuum. And Steve Hassan wrote a popular book called The Cult of Trump, and very, very well researched and a really solid argument for how it is a type of a cult. I highly recommend that book, by the way.
Okay. And by the way, I live in Oregon City, and that church you talked about, there's a giant church I drive by a lot, and they have no name on it. I'm assuming it's the same one. It's on Malala.
Oh, there's so many cults around Oregon City.
Yeah, but that would, yeah, but I mean,
The followers of Christ are really big in Oregon and Idaho. I meant to bring today to pass out, but I'll put some links up for people. You can read the stories of the children who grew up in the followers of Christ in Oregon and Idaho. Rita Swan published the letters of some of these children talking about what it was like growing up. Without medical care, you can think, oh, no big deal, they can't go to the doctor, but you have to remember it's the intersectionalism of it all. They also don't have good thinking skills. When I left the cult, I was an idiot. How could I make friends when I had nothing in my head and no skills? I'd never traveled anywhere. I didn't have any talents. I wasn't interesting at all. And I mean, that's just the truth of it. It makes it harder to make friends and and trying to support myself and help my siblings. And those children, in terms of medical neglect, had it far worse than we did. They have stories that are very well documented about things like you break your bones or you have a badly infected wound, and they have you take a drink of Manischewitz. This goes on right here in Oregon right now. Drink a Manischewitz because that's Christ's body. It's kept in the refrigerator for all illnesses. And then they have this old rancid olive oil that they believe is blessed by the body of Christ. And so they'll put it on the infected wound or on the broken leg. And then you have people think about what happens if none of your medical or dental needs are met when you're a child. You know, like me, I left with rotting teeth and no money after being labor trafficked. And it's so common. I meet people from cults almost everywhere I go. I had a friend once, I was telling him I grew up in a cult, and it turned out he was in a sister cult to mine, one of the ones we knew. I was so surprised by that. And he lives here in Sherwood. Your followers of Christ are horrible. And that's why we need to, promote the separation of church and state. That's why we need to keep Bibles out of public schools. Let the children decide for themselves when they're ready. This idea of churches here in the Portland area, taking children out of school where they could be learning science or math so they can go to a church service every week. I know that people at HGP and CFI have addressed that in some places in Portland and put a stop to that. So thank you. I appreciate the work you do. I'm a woman of many words.
It looks like we have two questions from the Friendly House, and standing at the mic right now, we have Mr. Mike Boucher.
Hello. Yeah, you're just segueing into my question. For me, it's the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that the 2/3 Supreme Court majority seems to be having a field day with and passing, well, just going on their shadow docket and declaring this invalid and that invalid, whatever. But anyway, you have great concern that these smaller cults are going to take advantage of those rulings as well, which are, these rulings are based on, very conservative parts of organized, very well-established religions.
It's very true. And, there are cases, I'll say, of the church to cult pipeline. And, if you grow up with some belief systems in some religions, then you're more likely to be comfortable with some of the ideas from the cults that might recruit you. I'm sorry, what did you ask me a question?
In a way, yeah. I thought I'd bring that up.
I welcome comments. You don't have to ask a question, but do you by chance have a question for that?
I thought that was the question. I'll admit I'm not the greatest questioner in the world, but yeah, but
I'm not the best presenter, so there we
Okay.
go.
Yeah, but anyway, do you see a lot of that happening with these smaller cults that you mentioned?
Well, the homeschooling, yeah. So there's a surge of people promoting homeschooling right now. And I'm sure I don't know, everybody's looking up for something going on I don't know about. Is the building on fire? There is a huge problem with homeschooling. So many people are doing homeschooling to either cover abuse, pretty common, or you have families that have such extreme ideas about the world, whether they're religious or aliens are going to beam them up to Venus. There's a woman who wrote a book called When the World Didn't End. It's in my exhibit at the library. And she is an actress in Hollywood, a screenwriter. I saw her in a movie recently. And she grew up being told the world was going to end, like me. I grew up being told that. And that aliens were going to beam them up to Venus. And a lot of people actually believed that. So there's a lot of weird cults out there.
So I'll ask a follow-up question that's on that theme. It seems like we're living in a society right now where cult activity could be on the rise. We had COVID, where people were isolated from the community. We have a politically divided country right now. And do these environments contribute to increased cult activity? And what data supports that?
This is something I know very little about, but I will tell you, it's a very good question or questions. At the International Cultic Studies Association's conference this last July, last month, the theme was cults in the time of COVID. And, think about it, people are home more, people are going to knock on your door. And as you know, some of the people in your midst are really good about talking those people out of whatever they've come to talk you into. I love that you guys do that. And so that is an issue I've heard a good bit about. Also, people when they are struggling financially or mental health. Remember, there was a huge shortage of therapists during COVID. There's still a shortage, but it was much worse during COVID because all these people who had never seen a therapist before were like trying to bottleneck into the system. And so that is an issue. And what was the other that you said? COVID. And yeah, I hear culture on the rise right now, which surprises me because of social media. The experts like Steve Hassan and Hope Bastine and other people who know a lot more than me do say that cults are on the rise. And it's smaller cults. The bigger cults are not forming. They're just around still, like the Moonies. And did you know, I always do cult trivia at my events. I should do that next time I'm here. So the Moonies actually married, when they married all those couples at the same time, that huge, was it 100 or 1,000? I can't remember. A lot of them didn't even speak the same language and had never met. It's like, you two are getting married. So, I mean, there's just so many weird things that people will latch onto and be manipulated to do, I mean, I believed some of what I was told as a child. The world was going to end in 5 years. I didn't believe that, but I believed a lot of the nutty stuff because everyone around me believed it. Michael Shermer's The Believing Brain explains that.
Let's go back to the friendly house for a question from Renga.
Okay. I see that all the counter cult activists you have listed are women. Are there men also? The counter cult activists you have listed are all women. Are there men also involved in this thing? And
Oh, I'm so glad you asked
the other
that.
thing is, are there more women part of the members of the cults than men? I presume that the men are the one who are controlling these cults.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about all of that. And it's something else we've been talking about in our community for a couple of years now. Most of the work done by volunteers that any of us are aware of are women. And a lot of the men have careers. Some of the women have careers in the field too, being a therapist or a public speaker or something. And I meant to have a slide for Steve Hassan. I would definitely do that in the future. I haven't put together a PowerPoint presentation for over 15 years, and this was open source. And oh, so funny and ironically, the program I used is called Impress. Well, I told you at the outset, bear with me. There are some wonderful men in our arena. There's also a lot of patriarchy, honestly. If you think about patriarchy anywhere else in the world, it's everywhere. But if you come from a cult where men dominated, which is any cult I can think of, the men had more power, and then the men get out of it, they recognize, oh, I was in a cult. I grew up in a cult, or I joined a cult, or I started a cult. I want to make a difference. I know about cults. I'm going to go get a master's degree or PhD in coercive treatment or whatever. There's a variety of different advanced degrees that the people in our world get. You might have noticed that from the slides I did have up. And but then the men are used to having their own way. It's just how it's always been. You know, I'm going to say this publicly, and I know I'm going to get backlash, but I don't care. I just did a podcast with a man who is from the JW. And I mentioned that we were working on media and ethics in our community and some of the issues and why. And so he didn't publish the podcast. And he sent me a hateful email and said, don't ever contact me again. I didn't know we were in, it was an interview I did with another woman. It went really well. It was one of the better ones I've ever done. No, it was with Tabitha Chapman. And he was angry with me, saying that I was arrogantly pushing my agenda. I was just on it all the time, because he has a podcast and he doesn't want to have guidelines. We're just establishing guidelines. And he said, you're trying to police us. We don't want to police anybody. We just want to have guidelines. You can choose to follow them if you want, but it's that much of an issue. So now in my mind, he's one of the harmful ones. I didn't see him that way before. My third time doing his podcast. I told my friend Tabitha before we did it, I said, well, look out, he's patriarchal. And then we get all of this happening. And so Tabitha and I are going to be meeting regarding that tomorrow. And Counter Coalition will be sending him an invoice, because I took my time to set up the podcast, opportunity costs, my time, my expertise. It didn't run. That's an implicit contract. So I don't think he'll pay me, but I want to start setting a precedent. You know, that's not okay. And, you know, with people I've talked to in the field, they've said, no, you didn't do anything wrong. You know, it's just, he doesn't want to. So we have some issues with the men in patriarchy. I will say with some of the men, they're wonderful men in our arena. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah, some of you may have heard of Pitcairn Island. It's where the mutineers from the Bounty settled after the mutiny on the Bounty in the 1790s. They brought women from Tahiti with them. They were kind of considered a quaint, remote civilization, very little contact with the outside world for 200 years. But it was a British possession. And sometime about 10 years ago, a young woman who was an intern in law enforcement in England got sent there to do an internship in law enforcement, and discovered that there was lots of sex on Pitcairn Island between men and very young women, down to ages perhaps younger than the age of 10.
Not surprising. It's common.
Right, but the men defended it, or yeah, the people said these were traditional practices going back to Tahiti for 7 or 8 generations. Everybody on Pitcairn Island is exactly 50% Tahitian because all the women were from Tahiti and 50% English. And they say these are our traditional practices. This is not anything unusual. But they put most of the men on Pitcairn Island in jail, but there are still a few on the outside. And as I believe the female population is also way down. I think they were sending women to work on some other islands or something and bring home a little foreign exchange. And a lot of the women decided to go from the other islands to the outside world. So the female population was way down. But as I last I ever read about it, it was still there. I think there were still some men and some women still living in this traditional culture, despite all the exposure of what was going on. And I thought you might know if that's still in operation or not.
The only thing I know is the little bit I've read online. I don't know anything about that particular group, but I would say that in most places, whether it is your tradition or your religion, your deeply held faith, if it's against the law, it's a crime. And so we don't have to worry about or look at or be intimidated by, as so many people in the United States are. You know, we can't touch that. It's someone's belief system. You can practice your belief as long as you're not harming someone. And so just saying, it doesn't matter what they say. If it's against the law there, they should go to prison. And if it's not against the law, it should be.
Yeah, they're in prison on Pitcairn Island, and there's too few men outside of prison to unload the boats when they bring in the supplies. They have to let the men out of prison to unload the boats once a month. But besides that, they're imprisoned.
That's ridiculous.
We have question number 4 from the Friendly House.
Yeah, thank you. Very enlightening presentation. I'm thinking about the definition of harm and child abuse and wondering about enforcement of cultish behavior on the part of, for example, state child care services.
Well, we come at that from a variety of ways. In one of the cases from the followers of Christ, they wouldn't let their son go to school because he had been so badly injured in a car accident, and they didn't want the teachers to know. And the school said, your kid either needs to show up in school or they need to have a doctor's note. So they had to take him to the doctor. And they took him to the doctor, but then they took away the pain meds, and which is really common. And there's a lot of stories about children having surgery with no pain meds. And so, but like in that case, you're kind of calling their bluff or pushing them, saying, prove it. In regard to other forms of child abuse, if you look at the followers of Christ, for example, being required to take their children to the doctor, that's another one. So you've got the schools there. Also with child abuse, one way that people find out about it is when underage girls show up pregnant and then they find out that it was from their siblings or their father. That's common in the Amish communities. And, then law enforcement gets involved. And I've never heard anybody be concerned about spanking or things like that, even though, spanking has been proven to be harmful physiologically, emotionally. It makes it harder for children to learn. Some bedwetting is caused by, heavy spanking. But there's just bigger fish to fry. There's so much worse going on. So if you're asking about what constitutes child abuse, it's usually it's somebody showing up to school with a lot of bruises and can't sit down. I've heard that story several times for people from cults. Relatives calling the police because they recognize something isn't okay. In the Children of God, there's the book Not Without My Sister that you can get at the Portland Library. Right now, I think it's only on ebook and audiobook. I have a copy, and I will loan it here for several months to HGP. So I'll put a bunch of cult memoir in HGP's library the beginning of September after ICAM, after I'm done using it, and then let you guys like read them for a couple months. But anyway, there's stories in there, like the children were given these comics that they grew up with, and they did not go to public school at all. And they could only play outside if they had a like walled in guarded area where nobody could see them, because people were looking for the children for very good reason. So they had like windows blacked out. They would often be driven around on the floor of the car with curtains in the car so nobody knew they had children there. And because there's a reason why it's considered, you know, like the worst cult for children. Anyway, so one of the things that I've read that has happened is the comic showing children how to have sex with adults. These little girls were reading it, not thinking anything of it. And their grandfather, who they were visiting, saw it and was absolutely furious. So it ends up bubbling up here and there. You know, with the Amish, it's usually related to pregnancy. I don't think I answered your question, but.
Lisa, I had one more question for you. And a clarification on something you said during Q&A. It seems like one of the ways to counter cult activity is community involvement and people becoming aware of cults. But then you also said, don't eat at the Loving Hut because it's a cult. Wouldn't another way to counter that be have many people eat there and expose the workers to a different way of life?
Only if you went there and talked to them about that and you're good at it. I don't know that I would be comfortable talking to them about it, but who knows? When I passed the JW on 21st and 23rd Street, you know, they have a lot of volunteers because there's always someone new out there. And as I'm walking by, I say things. I have friends who are ex-JW and I don't like being shunned. They never got to see their families again the next time I walk by. I have friends who are ex-JW and they enjoy celebrating their birthdays. And the next time I walk by, I'm sure they talk about that crazy woman.
Okay, excellent job with the presentation this morning, Lisa, and thank you so much for a spirited Q&A. We're going to leave it there and get to announcements.